Today we're going to discuss some foundational ideas on both the concept and the practice of translanguaging. Now, what is translanguaging, you may ask? My name is Paulie Badenhorst, and in the years that I've been teaching, I have found that often the best way to convey or describe a concept is to refer to metaphor. And so I would like you to imagine the following situation. I would like you to think back into your past. I would like you to think about a particular trip or a journey that you undertook. Now, this may have been recent, or it may have been a trip or journey that you undertook during your childhood. It may have been a happy journey. It may have been a journey filled with excitement and new discovery. Have you thought of a journey? Right. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to consider the boundaries that you crossed during that journey. When you stepped outside of your front door, you crossed a boundary from inside the home to outside the home. And then when you stepped into the car, you crossed a boundary from outside the car to inside the car. Later, when you backed the car up from the driveway into the road, you crossed a boundary from private property to public property. Later you drove and you crossed the boundary from one suburb into another, from the city into a rural area, and even later perhaps you crossed the boundary from one state into another. Now I want you to imagine the following situation. Imagine my wife and I on a beautiful summer day in June. Imagine we're traveling through Pennsylvania. The sky is blue, sweet breeze, and our windows are open. Well, we keep driving, and at one point I remark to my wife and I say, "Honey, look at the sign. It says, 'Welcome to West Virginia.'" My wife might look back at me and say, "Wow, honey, we're in West Virginia now. It's lovely to be in West Virginia." Now, I'd like you to imagine the same situation happening at night. Only this time I'd like you to imagine my wife is sleeping next to me. She's not awake. Also, one of the headlights on our car is broken. It's not working. And so I'm focused on keeping the car on the road. We happen to pass the same sign that says "Welcome to West Virginia." However, I do not see it. I'm too busy concentrating. Now, what happened there? We crossed a boundary. When we crossed the boundary, there was no bump in the road. There was only a sign. And because I never saw the sign, the boundary, technically speaking, didn't exist. And much in the same way, the boundaries that we impose on language are very much the same. They are porous and they are fluid. And if we're not told that a particular boundary exists, we very often don't recognize it. We can also map the metaphor of journey over language. When we map the metaphor of journey over language, we're really talking about translanguaging. Now, translanguaging assumes two things. Firstly, translanguaging assumes that communication transcends individual language. Let me say that again. Communication transcends individual language. Also, translanguaging assumes that communication involves diverse semiotic resources being employed in the construction and negotiation of meaning. One more time. Translanguaging assumes that communication involves diverse semiotic resources being employed in the construction and negotiation of meaning. Now, of course, African scholars recently have been saying, "But you're talking about this phenomenon called translanguaging in the West. But we've been doing these things. We've been utilizing these practices for hundreds, if not thousands of years." You see, what happened was there were times in the past when colonial settlers would come and settle in Africa, would meet the tribes, and then would categorize and start to catalog the languages of the tribes for purposes related to missionary activity, writing of dictionaries, etc., etc. And so what happened is that many of these tribes, who often would communicate with one another through translanguaging processes, through very fluid linguistic processes of exchange, suddenly now were told that they in fact spoke different languages. And of course, when this happened, it also resulted in a situation that they became categorized into particular ethnicities and tribes. So what does this tell us? It tells us that for as long as we've been human, that we have in fact used translanguaging. In fact, for as long as we've possessed language, we as humans have been translanguaging. And we do it all the time. Consider even as monolinguals, we participate in translanguaging. You do not have to speak more than one language in order to translanguage. Let me give you a very common example. Imagine I was attempting to describe a song to you, and I kind of suspect that you know this song, but I'm giving you clues and you're just not getting what I'm referring to. So I might say something like, man, it's that song that was like used in the 1995 Rugby World Cup. It's a song with like an African feel. It's got an African vibe. Oh, you know what? It's a song. It's got like something about a lion. Maybe you do not know what I'm referring to at this moment, but the moment I start translanguaging, the moment I do this, you know the song, right? The lion sleeps tonight. And so what I've done is I've crossed from one language into another form, and through using these languages together, I've constructed a meaning that you can find understandable and that you could relate to. And of course, that's not the only example. There are many other examples too, in terms of how within music, musicians often cross between languages. Think, for instance, of the American Hispanic band Los Abandoned and the way that they cross between English and Spanish, or the South African rap rave band The Antwoord, who often cross from English into Afrikaans, into Zulu, into Xhosa. What about that song? You remember that famous song from the past? Tell me when will you be mine? Quando, 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 right? So we see this phenomenon happen in music and in the arts and in entertainment. We, however, do it ourselves. Now, of course, we're not necessarily speaking about language and music today as separate things. We're also talking about other languages. We're talking about moving from English into Chinese, or maybe moving from French into Korean. People do this all the time, and that is called translanguaging. Now, English language learners and multilingual language users certainly naturally gravitate towards translanguaging practices unless unnatural boundaries are imposed over them, unless they're told that it's wrong to do so, unless they're told that, well, you know what, we're here to speak English today. If that's not told to them, English users and English language learners naturally tend to mix languages and move between languages. Now let's look at some examples here of these boundaries that are often imposed upon language learners. One of them is a movement that certainly has gained a large ascendancy in certain parts of the world, most notably Asia, and it's called the Teaching English in English movement. And so there are various companies, a company like YBM, which is a private language institution, who insist that language learners in the classroom only use English. The British Council is another group who for years maintained that in order to successfully learn a language, you should only learn it within a single language context. In other words, teaching English and learning English in English. Of course, then we also had the English-only movement in the United States, who for a long time insisted on particular forms of monolingual immersion within classroom contexts. And of course, it was a conservative movement. Now, whenever you find people insisting on one particular language being used, more often than not, they are speaking from a position of privilege. And also sometimes what happens is they're not just talking from a position of privilege, but they're often speaking from a position of a superiority or an assumed superiority. In other words, English is my language, I see myself as superior, therefore you will speak my language and submit